In the spring of 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot hacked his way through the Cambodian jungle, following whispers of ancient ruins hidden beneath centuries of overgrowth. What he found stopped him cold. Rising above the canopy stood towers of carved stone so massive, so intricate that he could barely comprehend what he was seeing. He wrote in his journal that he had discovered a civilization that rivaled ancient Greece and Rome. But here is what Mouhot did not understand. What nobody understood until satellite imagery finally revealed the truth over 150 years later. He had not discovered a temple. He had stumbled into the edge of the largest pre-industrial city on Earth. Angkor Wat, the temple everyone recognizes from photographs, covers 402 acres. To put that in perspective, Vatican City, the entire country, measures just 110 acres. But Angkor Wat was never the city. It was just one temple in a sprawling metropolis that stretched across more than 3,000 square kilometers.
Fresh fruit.
That is larger than modern-day London,
Finest
larger
silks
than
from the
Los
east.
Angeles.
Finest
When
silks.
satellites finally mapped the full
water
extent
on a
of
hot
Angkor
day.
using laser technology in 2015, archaeologists realized they had underestimated the city's size by 300%, 3 times larger than anyone imagined. Between 750,000 and 1 million people lived in Angkor at its height. To understand how staggering that number is, consider this. In the year 1200, Paris, the largest city in Europe, housed around 110,000 people. London held maybe 80,000. Angkor was not just big for its time. It was incomprehensibly massive. It was a metropolis that would not be matched in size anywhere on Earth for another 600 years. And then, sometime between the 1340s and 1431, every single person left. 750,000 people, gone. The temples stood empty. The canals ran dry. The markets fell silent. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. We have no idea where they went. There are no mass graves, no evidence of plague pits, no layers of ash suggesting the city burned, no destruction debris indicating a final catastrophic battle. When archaeologists dig through the soil layers of Angkor, they find something far more disturbing than violence. They find nothing. No sudden break, no trauma layer, just an absence. As if one day, the entire population simply walked away and never came back. Think about what it takes to abandon a city. Not a village, not a town, a city of nearly 1 million people. Imagine evacuating modern-day San Francisco or Seattle. Every person, every family, every street vendor, every priest, every farmer who worked the rice paddies. Where do you move that many people? How do you coordinate it? And most importantly, why does nobody write down what happened? The last major temple inscription in Angkor dates to 1327. After that year, the stone tablets that had documented every significant event for over 500 years suddenly go silent. 104 years before the commonly accepted date of Angkor's fall. For more than a century, a city of nearly 1 million people kept functioning, kept living, kept breathing, but nobody carved a single word into stone about what was happening. Does that sound like a gradual decline to you? Or does it sound like something nobody wanted remembered? When the jungle finally swallowed Angkor, it did so with a speed that defies natural explanation. By the time European explorers arrived in the 1800s, trees older than the United States had wrapped their roots around temple towers. Strangler figs, some measuring 30 feet in diameter, had broken apart stone blocks that weighed several tons each. 400 years is not enough time for a jungle to completely consume a stone city of this magnitude. Not naturally, unless something accelerated the process. Unless the irrigation systems that kept the jungle at bay were deliberately destroyed. Here is where the official story starts to fall apart. The standard explanation you will find in textbooks goes like this. Climate change caused droughts and floods. The hydraulic system failed. The Siamese army from Ayutthaya invaded in 1431. The Khmer people relocated to Phnom Penh. End of story. Except that explanation ignores almost everything we actually know. First, the hydraulic system. Angkor was not just a city. It was the most sophisticated water management civilization in the pre-industrial world. The West Baray, the largest reservoir, measured 8 kilometers long and 2.1 kilometers wide. That is 11.8 square kilometers of hand-dug water storage, 1,500 football fields, dug by hand, connected by over 1,000 kilometers of canals and channels that fed water to rice paddies year-round using nothing but gravity. No pumps, no modern technology, just stone, mathematics, and an understanding of hydraulics that would not be matched in Europe for another 800 years. This system allowed Angkor to produce 2, sometimes 3 rice harvests per year when every other civilization on Earth was lucky to get one. That abundance supported the massive population. That abundance built the temples. And here is the critical point. That system was designed specifically to survive droughts and floods. The engineers who built Angkor understood monsoon variability. They built redundancy into every canal, every reservoir, every water channel. So, when climate scientists point to the mega droughts of the 1340s and 1370s and say that is what killed Angkor, they are ignoring a fundamental question. Why would a drought destroy a civilization that had engineered itself specifically to survive droughts? Unless the drought was unlike anything they had ever seen before, unless it was not just a drought, unless something else was happening at the same time. Before we go further, I need you to do something. Look at where you are right now. Comment below what part of the world you are watching from, because here is what most people do not realize. Lost civilizations are not just ancient history happening somewhere far away. The patterns that destroyed Angkor are the same patterns appearing in soil samples from Central America, from the Middle East, from China. Whatever happened in the 1400s was global. And depending on where you are sitting right now, you might be closer to a lost civilization than you think. If you are the kind of person who questions the official story, who wants to dig deeper than what gets taught in schools, then this channel is for you. Hit that subscribe button for Tales Before Tesla, and turn on notifications, because we are about to go places mainstream history does not want you to see. Now let us talk about what they are not telling you. The Siamese invasion of 1431 is treated as historical fact. Thai forces from the kingdom of Ayutthaya marched on Angkor, sacked the city, and the Khmer court fled. Except when you actually look at the archaeological evidence, none of that makes sense. Cities that get sacked leave evidence, buildings burn, walls get torn down, valuables get looted, and the looters leave behind broken pottery, scattered coins, and disturbed burial sites. When Rome sacked Carthage, archaeologists found a destruction layer 6 feet thick. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, the burn marks are still visible on standing structures 800 years later. Angkor? Nothing. The temples stand intact. There are no scorch marks on the stones, no mass graves of defenders, no hordes of quickly buried treasure that people hid before fleeing. The only damage to Angkor's temples is weathering and jungle growth. If the Siamese army really conquered the largest city in the world, they did so without fighting a single battle bloody enough to leave archaeological evidence. Does that sound like a military conquest? Or does it sound like an army marching into a city that was already empty? Here is the timeline nobody wants to talk about. 1327, the last Sanskrit inscription. 1296 to 1297. A Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan visits Angkor and describes a thriving, wealthy, functioning city. Then silence. Over 130 years of silence before 1431, when the Thais supposedly invade. What happened during those 130 years? Why did a civilization that had documented everything suddenly stop writing anything down? Some researchers suggest the elite left first. That the royal family, the priests, the scholars, they saw something coming and evacuated decades before the common people even realized the city was dying. The inscriptions stopped because the people who could read and write were already gone. Think about that. If you knew your civilization was ending, if you had access to resources and knowledge that common people did not, would you stay and face collapse? Or would you quietly disappear while everyone else kept going through the motions? And here is the question that should bother you more than any other. Where did 750,000 people go? You cannot hide that many people. You cannot move them without leaving a trail. Yet, there is no archaeological evidence of a sudden population boom anywhere else in Southeast Asia during the 1400s. No records of a mass migration, no stories passed down through generations of the great exodus from Angkor. It is as if they walked into the jungle and vanished into the earth itself. The jungle consumed Angkor faster than should be possible. The irrigation channels that had kept the forest at bay for 600 years filled with silt and vegetation within decades. Trees that take centuries to grow were already ancient by the time Europeans arrived 400 years later. Either the natural reclamation of Angkor happened far faster than ecology suggests is possible, or somebody deliberately sabotaged the water systems to ensure the jungle would erase the city as quickly as possible. We are about to explore 800 years of mysteries, cover-ups, and evidence that does not fit the story you were taught in school. We are going to look at climate data that shows something terrifying happening in the 1300s. We are going to examine archaeological discoveries that governments do not want excavated. We are going to talk about religious transformations that tore the social fabric apart, and we are going to discuss theories involving mercury poisoning, magnetic anomalies, and metallurgical secrets that suggest Angkor knew things we have forgotten. But first, we need to understand what Angkor actually was. Because the biggest secret of all is this: the hydraulic empire that controlled water across 3,000 square kilometers was not just advanced for its time. Some of the engineering should not have been possible at all. The Roman aqueducts are considered one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. They carried water across hundreds of miles using precise gradients, stone arches, and mathematical calculations that still impress modern engineers. At their peak, Rome's 11 aqueducts delivered roughly 1 million cubic meters of water per day to a city of 1 million people. Impressive, absolutely. But Angkor's water system made Rome look like a child playing with garden hoses. By the year 1200, Angkor had constructed a hydraulic network that moved, stored, and distributed water across an area 30 times larger than the city of Rome. Not just for drinking, for agriculture, for religious ceremonies, for urban planning, and for something else entirely. Something the engineers who study these systems today still cannot fully explain. Let us start with the West Beret, because until you understand the scale of this structure, nothing else makes sense. Imagine digging a rectangular hole 8 kilometers long, 2.1 kilometers wide, and 5 meters deep, by hand. With copper tools and bamboo baskets, the West Beret alone required the removal of roughly 72 million cubic meters of earth. To put that in perspective, the Great Pyramid of Giza contains about 2.5 million cubic meters of stone. The West Beret is 28 Great Pyramids worth of excavated material, and that was just one reservoir. The East Beret, built earlier, measured 7.8 kilometers by 1.8 kilometers. Together, these two reservoirs could hold over 120 million cubic meters of water, enough to supply modern-day Philadelphia for a year. And these were not natural lakes. These were engineered structures with precisely graded bottoms, controlled inflow channels, and distribution gates that regulated water pressure across the entire system. But here is where it gets strange. The West Beret was not built where it made geographical sense. Engineers today scratch their heads looking at the location because the natural topography would have placed a reservoir several kilometers to the east where the terrain naturally collected water. Instead, the Khmer builders placed it exactly where it sits, which required building massive embankments and rerouting natural water flows. Why? Why make the job exponentially harder than it needed to be? The answer lies in the network. The Beret was never just about storing water. It was a node in a system that distributed water with surgical precision across 3,000 square kilometers. And when laser mapping technology finally revealed the full extent of Angkor's canals in 2012, archaeologists found something that should not exist. A hydraulic network so complex, so mathematically precise, that it could only have been designed with a complete understanding of the entire system before a single shovel of dirt was moved. Think about what that means. Modern cities are built in stages. You construct a neighborhood, then expand infrastructure as the city grows. Trial and error, gradual development. Angkor's water system shows no evidence of gradual development. The entire network, all 1,000 kilometers of canals, appears to have been conceived as a unified design from the beginning. Someone sat down with a complete map of 3,000 square kilometers and calculated where every canal, every reservoir, every distribution gate needed to be before construction began. Who does that? What civilization in the 9th century has the surveying technology, the mathematical knowledge, and the organizational capacity to pre-plan a hydraulic network larger than any modern city. The Romans built gradually over centuries. The Chinese extended the Grand Canal piece by piece across dynasties. But Angkor's system suggests a level of pre-planning that implies knowledge we assume they did not have. The canals themselves present another mystery. Modern engineers analyzing the gradients discovered something remarkable. The water channels maintain slopes between 0.1 and 0.5%. That is a drop of 1 to 5 meters per kilometer. Too steep, and the water erodes the channel. Too shallow, and sediment clogs the system. The Khmer engineers hit the perfect gradient across 1,000 kilometers of channels without modern surveying equipment. They did this by eye, by mathematics, and by an understanding of fluid dynamics that European engineers would not match until the 1800s. But the system did more than move water. It controlled the temperature and humidity of the entire urban area. The vast surface area of the Berais acted as heat sinks during the day and released moisture at night, creating a microclimate that moderated the tropical extremes. Rice paddies were arranged in a specific pattern that maximized water retention while preventing flooding. The entire city was essentially air-conditioned by water management. This was not just engineering. This was ecological design on a scale that modern urban planners still struggle to achieve. Now, here is the part that makes researchers uncomfortable. The precision required to build this system implies survey-grade measurements across 3,000 square kilometers. The slope calculations alone would require understanding calculus-level mathematics, the ability to predict water flow, pressure distribution, and seasonal variation suggests hydrological knowledge that took Europeans another 1,000 years to develop. So, either the Khmer civilization independently invented advanced mathematics and engineering centuries ahead of everyone else, or they inherited this knowledge from somewhere we have not acknowledged. There are researchers, admittedly controversial ones, who point to similarities between Angkor's hydraulic system and other ancient water management civilizations that appeared seemingly out of nowhere. The pre-Columbian Amazonian cultures built raised field systems with canal networks that mirror Angkorian designs. The Nabatean civilization in Petra controlled water in the desert using techniques that parallel Khmer engineering. Mohenjo-Daro, in the Indus Valley, had urban water systems in 3000 BCE that show similar sophistication. Are these independent inventions? Or are we looking at fragments of a shared knowledge base that spread across the ancient world through means we do not understand? I am not saying ancient aliens. I am saying that mainstream archaeology has a habit of underestimating what ancient people were capable of. But there is a difference between respecting ancient ingenuity and ignoring evidence that does not fit comfortable narratives. And Angkor's hydraulic system has evidence that makes people very uncomfortable. In 2015, a team led by archaeologist Damien Evans used LIDAR technology to map Angkor from the air. LIDAR uses laser pulses to see through jungle canopy and create topographical maps of the ground below. What they found rewrote everything. Beneath the jungle, they discovered hundreds of previously unknown temples. But more importantly, they found water channels that predated the official founding of Angkor in 802. Channels that showed erosion patterns, suggesting they were far older than anyone wanted to admit. Erosion analysis is a standard archaeological technique. Water flowing over stone creates predictable wear patterns based on flow rate and time. When geologists examined some of Angkor's oldest stone channels, they found erosion that should have taken over 1,000 years to form. But according to the official timeline, those channels were only built in the 900s. Either the water flow was exponentially higher than physically possible, or those channels are significantly older than 802. This creates a problem. If Angkor's hydraulic infrastructure predates the Khmer Empire, then who built it? The standard story says the Khmer king Jayavarman II founded Angkor in 802 after unifying the region. But Chinese chronicles from the Tang dynasty, written in the 600s, describe visiting advanced cities in the Khmer region with sophisticated water systems already in place, 200 years before the official founding date. The academic response to this discrepancy is usually silence. Papers that suggest pre-Angkorian hydraulic civilizations have difficulty getting published. Research grants for excavating pre-802 sites are mysteriously denied. There is an institutional resistance to pushing Angkor's timeline backward because it creates uncomfortable questions about everything else we think we know about Southeast Asian history. But let us return to what we can prove. The hydraulic system, regardless of when it was truly built, enabled Angkor to do something no other civilization could do: grow rice year-round. Most of the world was locked into single harvest cycles dictated by seasonal rains. Angkor's water control allowed 2, sometimes 3 harvests per year. That surplus fed the massive population. That surplus freed laborers to build temples. That surplus created the wealth that made Angkor the center of Southeast Asian civilization for 600 years. Which brings us back to the central paradox. If Angkor's water system was this sophisticated, this resilient, this over-engineered for redundancy, then how did a drought destroy it? The official story claims the mega-droughts of the 1340s stressed the system beyond capacity, but engineers who study the network say that makes no sense. The system had more than enough reserve capacity to handle decades of reduced rainfall. The barrages alone could store multiple years of water supply. The canal network could be adjusted to prioritize essential areas during shortage. Unless the drought was not the real problem, unless something else caused the system to fail. And when you look at the evidence, there are signs that the hydraulic network did not collapse from drought. It was deliberately destroyed. In certain sections of the canal network, archaeologists have found evidence of intentional blockages. Stone and timber debris placed strategically to disrupt water flow. These are not natural blockages from neglect. These are engineered sabotage points designed to cascade failures through the system. Someone with detailed knowledge of how the network functioned systematically destroyed it from within. Why would anyone sabotage their own water supply? That is a question we are going to answer. But first, we need to talk about what the tree rings are telling us, because the climate data from the 1300s reveals something far more terrifying than a simple drought. Trees do not lie. Unlike human records that can be destroyed, rewritten, or conveniently lost, trees keep perfect archives of climate locked inside their rings. Every year of growth leaves a signature. Wet years produce wide rings. Drought years create narrow bands, barely visible to the naked eye. When climatologists extracted core samples from ancient Vietnamese cypress trees in 2007, they found something that made them recalculate everything they thought they knew about medieval Southeast Asia. The 1340s were hell on earth. Brendan Buckley and his team at Columbia University published their findings in 2010, and the data was unambiguous. Starting around 1340 and continuing into the 1370s, mainland Southeast Asia experienced the most severe sustained drought in the last 1,000 years. Not a bad year, not even a bad decade. 30 to 40 years of rainfall so diminished that tree growth nearly stopped. Some rings from this period are almost invisible, indicating years where precipitation dropped to levels that should have killed the forests entirely. But droughts alone do not explain Angkor's collapse, because Angkor had survived droughts before. The tree ring data shows earlier dry periods in the 1100s and 1200s. Angkor weathered those. The city kept functioning, the temples kept rising, and the inscriptions continued documenting royal activities without interruption. So, what made the 14th century drought different? The answer came from an unexpected source: sediment cores pulled from the bottom of the West Baray. When researchers analyzed layers of mud deposited over centuries, they found a pattern that contradicts everything the drought theory predicts. Yes, there are layers from the 1340s showing reduced water inflow, consistent with drought conditions. But directly above those drought layers, they found something bizarre. Massive sediment deposits indicating catastrophic flooding, not gradual rainfall return. Sudden, violent water surges that dumped tons of silt into the reservoir in extremely short time periods. Drought followed immediately by extreme flooding. That is not a climate pattern, that is climate chaos. Researchers like Dan Penny from the University of Sydney pieced together what this means. Angkor's hydraulic system was designed for predictable monsoon variability. The reservoirs filled during wet season, distributed water during dry season, year after year, century after century. But in the 1300s, that predictability vanished. The monsoons failed completely for years, then returned with unprecedented violence. The system was not designed for that. Nobody's system was designed for that. When the mega floods hit after years of drought, the physics working against Angkor were brutal. Dried out canal beds could not absorb the sudden influx. Water moving too fast erodes instead of irrigates. The sediment loads in the floodwater were so high that they clogged distribution gates, buried intake channels, and filled the carefully graded canals with debris. In a single wet season, decades of maintenance could be undone. But even that does not fully explain the collapse. Hydraulic systems can be repaired, channels can be dredged, gates can be rebuilt. Angkor had survived 600 years by maintaining its water infrastructure. Why did they stop maintaining it in the 1300s? The answer might be hiding in plain sight. In Europe, in China, in the Middle East. Because while Angkor was dying, something was happening to the entire planet. 1400 years ago, Earth's climate entered a transition period that scientists now call the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped globally. Glaciers advanced in Europe and Asia. Growing seasons shortened. Monsoon patterns shifted. And while Europe's medieval warm period was ending, bringing famine and instability, the tropics were experiencing their own catastrophic changes. The mega drought that hit Southeast Asia was not isolated. It was part of a planetary climate shift. Tree rings from Mongolia show the same 1340s drought. Chinese historical records document massive famines during the exact same period. Mayan cities in Central America, already in decline, received their death blow from drought cycles that mirror what happened in Cambodia. Civilizations separated by oceans, with no contact with each other, all experiencing simultaneous climate catastrophe. Coincidence? Or were they all responding to the same global forcing mechanism? This is where we need to talk about the sun. And before you roll your eyes, understand that solar activity directly affects Earth's climate in ways mainstream science is only beginning to acknowledge. Between 1280 and 1350, the sun entered a period of reduced output known as the Wolf minimum. Sunspot counts dropped. Solar radiation decreased measurably. And when the sun's output drops, Earth's climate does not respond uniformly. Some regions get colder, some get drier, and in the tropics, monsoon circulation patterns can fundamentally break down. But solar minimums happen regularly without collapsing civilizations. So what else was happening in the 1300s? The answer might be volcanic. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica contain trapped volcanic ash layers that allow scientists to date major eruptions with precision. In 1342, something exploded. The ash signature suggests a massive eruption somewhere in the tropics, possibly in Southeast Asia itself, though the exact volcano has never been identified. When volcanoes of that magnitude erupt, they inject sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating a global cooling effect that can last for years. Crops fail, rainfall patterns shift, and if your entire civilization depends on predictable monsoons, a major eruption can trigger cascading failures. Then, in 1362, another massive eruption, possibly Oreyfajikul in Iceland. Two mega eruptions within 20 years, occurring during a solar minimum, compounding an already stressed climate system. The 1-2-3 punch of reduced solar output, volcanic cooling, and disrupted monsoons could explain why the 1340s were uniquely catastrophic. But here is the unsettling part. When climate scientists model what those conditions would do to Angkor's water system, they keep running into the same conclusion. It should not have been fatal. Yes, the drought would stress the system. Yes, the flooding would cause damage. But total collapse? Complete abandonment? The models do not support that outcome unless something else was happening simultaneously. What if the climate catastrophe was not the cause of Angkor's collapse, but the trigger? What if the hydraulic system was already failing for other reasons, and the drought simply exposed weaknesses that had been building for decades? There is evidence supporting this theory. Sediment analysis from the canals shows that maintenance declined sharply starting in the early 1300s, decades before the megadrought. Channels that should have been dredged annually were left clogged. Distribution gates show wear patterns indicating they stopped being properly adjusted. The system was degrading from neglect before climate stress ever hit. Why would Angkor stop maintaining the very infrastructure that sustained it? Some researchers point to deforestation. Angkor's massive population required fuel for cooking and construction materials for buildings. 600 years of occupation meant 600 years of trees being cut faster than they could regrow. By the 1300s, the watershed surrounding Angkor may have been so deforested that erosion rates exploded. Topsoil washed into the canals faster than workers could remove it. LIDAR mapping revealed something that supports this theory. The areas immediately surrounding Angkor show almost no tree cover in the archaeological record by the late 1300s. But further out, in zones that should have been actively farmed, the forest had returned. That is backwards. If the city was thriving, you would expect clearing radiating outward from the center. Instead, the pattern suggests agricultural abandonment before the drought even started. Population was already leaving Angkor before the climate hit. But where were they going, and why? This is where the 30-year silence becomes critical. Remember, the last major temple inscription dates to 1327. The mega-drought starts around 1340. 13 years of gap. What happened during those 13 years that made the literate class stop recording their civilization's activities? One possibility is plague. The Black Death arrived in China in 1331, transmitted along the Silk Road from Central Asia. It reached Southeast Asia by the 1340s. Chinese records document massive die-offs in port cities. Angkor was not isolated. Trade routes connected it to the wider world. If plague hit Angkor in the 1330s, it would explain the inscription silence. Dead scribes cannot carve stones. But there are no mass graves, no evidence of hasty burials. Plague leaves archaeological signatures, and Angkor does not show them. So if not plague, then what silenced the record keepers? There is another theory, darker, more deliberately hidden. What if the inscriptions stopped because the people who controlled the writing system wanted them to stop? What if documenting what was really happening became too dangerous? Angkor was ruled by god-kings. The Devaraja cult held that the king was a living manifestation of divine power. His authority came from his ability to maintain cosmic order, which meant maintaining the water system. When the system started failing, when droughts came and floods followed and the canals filled with silt, what happened to the divine right of kings who could no longer control water? Social collapse does not always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like silence, like a civilization collectively deciding that some things are better left unrecorded, like scribes who understood that writing down the truth about failing infrastructure and incompetent leadership might get them killed. The climate data tells us what happened to the rain, but it cannot tell us what happened to the people. For that, we need to look at what mainstream archaeology refuses to excavate. On a humid morning in April 2012, archaeologist Damien Evans sat in a small aircraft circling over the Cambodian jungle, watching a computer screen display something impossible. The LIDAR system mounted beneath the plane was firing 1,600,000 laser pulses per second at the ground below, penetrating the thick canopy and mapping the terrain underneath. What appeared on his screen should not have existed. Temples, dozens of them, then hundreds, entire city grids, road networks connecting sites separated by kilometers of dense forest, reservoir systems feeding settlements that had never appeared on any map. By the time the survey finished, Evans and his team had documented over 1,000 previously unknown archaeological sites in the Angkor region alone. The official number of structures had just increased by orders of magnitude, and that created a serious problem. Because if there are hundreds of major temples nobody knew existed, what else is buried under that jungle? And more importantly, why is nobody digging? The Cambodian government, through the Apsara authority that controls all Angkor archaeological sites, maintains extremely strict excavation protocols. On paper, this makes sense. Angkor Wat is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Protection from looters and irresponsible archaeology is justified. But researchers who have applied for excavation permits describe a different reality. Certain sites are simply off-limits. No explanation, no appeal process, just blanket denials. Foreign archaeologists tell stories, usually off the record, of being granted permits for one location only to have them inexplicably revoked when preliminary surveys reveal unexpected findings. Others describe situations where Cambodian officials shut down digs mid-excavation after artifacts from wrong time periods emerge. The official reason is always preservation concerns, but the pattern suggests something else. Selective access based on what you might find. Dr. Miriam Stark from the University of Hawaii has worked in Cambodia for over 20 years. In a 2018 interview, she carefully chose her words when discussing excavation restrictions. There are political sensitivities around Angkorian chronology, she said. Discoveries that complicate the established narrative sometimes encounter bureaucratic obstacles. Translation: if your findings contradict the official timeline, expect problems. Why would anyone want to suppress archaeological evidence at Angkor? Follow the money. Tourism to Angkor generates over $60 million annually for Cambodia, a country where the average annual income is under $2,000. Angkor Wat appears on the national flag. It defines Cambodian national identity. The story of the Khmer Empire rising in 802, building the greatest Hindu-Buddhist civilization in Southeast Asia, then declining gracefully into history, is not just archaeology. It is mythology. It is pride. It is revenue. Now, imagine if excavations prove that Angkor's timeline is completely wrong, that the civilization is far older than currently accepted, that the temples were built on top of even earlier structures from cultures nobody can identify, that the Khmer Empire was not the first advanced civilization in the region, just the most recent. What happens to the tourism narrative? What happens to national identity built on being descended from the Angkor builders if it turns out the Angkor builders were themselves building on top of someone else's ruins? The LIDAR data already hints at this. In the published results from the 2012 and 2015 surveys, Evans and his team carefully noted something peculiar. Beneath the temples officially dated to the Angkorian period, the laser mapping revealed foundation structures using different construction techniques. Older stonework, different architectural styles. In several locations, the mapping showed that Khmer temples were built directly on top of pre-existing platforms that do not match any known Angkorian construction method. The report mentions this briefly, then moves on. No follow-up studies have been published. No excavations have been permitted to investigate these earlier structures. The findings were documented, filed, and effectively buried. But independent researchers noticed, and they started asking uncomfortable questions. Sandstone erosion rates are well understood. When water and wind wear away stone, they do so at predictable speeds based on stone composition, local climate, and exposure angle. Geologists can look at erosion patterns and estimate how long a stone's surface has been exposed to the elements. In 2009, a team of geologists examined the erosion on some of Angkor's oldest standing structures, particularly at Phnom Bakheng, a temple officially dated to late 800s. Their findings, published quietly in a specialized geology journal where few archaeologists would see them, indicated erosion patterns consistent with exposure times significantly exceeding the official dates, in some cases, by hundreds of years. The lead researcher suggested that either Angkor's humid climate accelerates erosion far more than models predict, or the structures are older than currently accepted, much older. That paper has been cited exactly 7 times in 15 years. Mainstream Angkor archaeology pretends it does not exist. Chinese records present another problem for the official timeline. The Tang dynasty, ruling China from 618 to 907, maintained detailed chronicles of tributary states and trading partners. Multiple entries from the late 700s describe diplomatic missions to the Chenla kingdoms in what is now Cambodia. These accounts mention visiting cities with stone temples reaching toward heaven and vast reservoirs supplying endless water. This is happening decades before Jayavarman II supposedly founded Angkor in Forman, 802. The standard academic response is that these Chinese accounts refer to earlier Khmer cities, not Angkor specifically. But when you compare the geographical descriptions in the Chinese texts to the actual location of Angkor, the match is precise. The chronicles describe a city north of the Great Lake, which is Tonle Sap. They describe mountains to the north with sacred temples, which matches Phnom Kulen, where Jayavarman supposedly established his capital. The Chinese were describing Angkor before Angkor officially existed. Either the Chinese records are wrong, which seems unlikely given their accuracy about everything else, or Angkor's founding date is wrong. There is a third option, that Jayavarman II did not found Angkor. He conquered it. He took control of an already existing city with established infrastructure and claimed it as his own creation. That would explain why the hydraulic system appears fully formed with no developmental stages. It was already there. This theory has supporters in genetic research. DNA analysis of modern Cambodian populations shows continuous occupation of the Angkor region going back over 2,000 years. There is no genetic bottleneck, no population replacement, no migration event around 802. The people who built Angkor were the descendants of people who had been living there for millennia. So why does the archaeological record pretend civilization suddenly appeared in the 9th century? Colonial archaeology has a long history of minimizing indigenous achievements. When French archaeologists first studied Angkor in the late 1800s, they could not believe that Southeast Asians had built such sophisticated structures. Early theories attributed Angkor to Romans, Greeks, or even lost tribes of Israel. Anything except accepting that Cambodian people engineered it themselves. When that became untenable, the narrative shifted to emphasizing Indianization, claiming Angkor was essentially an imported Indian civilization transplanted to Cambodia. Modern archaeology has moved past those racist assumptions, but the framework established by colonial-era researchers still dominates. The idea that Angkor sprang into existence around 802, reached its peak in the 1100s, then declined, is a Western narrative of rise and fall imposed on evidence that actually suggests something far more complex. A long continuity of civilization with Angkor as one phase in a much older story. But challenging that narrative threatens funding, threatens academic reputations, and threatens the tourism industry that depends on a clear, simple story. So, the evidence that contradicts the timeline gets ignored, minimized, or locked away. Let me give you a specific example that infuriates independent researchers. In 2016, a team excavating near the East Baray uncovered a stone foundation sealed beneath 6 meters of sediment. The stones showed tool marks inconsistent with known Khmer techniques. Carbon dating of organic material found in the sealed layer suggested deposition around 300 to 500 CE, 300 years before the official founding of Angkor. This find should have been major news. It appeared in exactly one Cambodian newspaper article, was never published in an archaeological journal, and the excavation permit for that site was not renewed. The stones were quietly reburied. The lead archaeologist returned to France. The site is now off-limits. How many other sites are off-limits? How many discoveries have been reburied? When you control access to archaeological sites, you control the narrative. And in Cambodia, the government tightly controls that access through a permitting system that ensures only research aligned with the established timeline gets approved. There are researchers who believe the real story of Angkor goes back not hundreds of years before 802, but thousands. They point to the sophisticated astronomical alignments built into temple layouts. Angkor Wat itself is aligned to the spring equinox with precision that requires long-term observation of celestial mechanics. The temple's design incorporates the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle. Why would 9th century builders encode astronomical knowledge requiring millennia of observation unless they had access to records from much earlier civilizations? Mainstream archaeology calls this pseudo-science. But those same mainstream archaeologists cannot explain how Khmer builders achieved the precision they did without advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge that appears nowhere else in the historical record. The knowledge exists in the stones. We just refuse to acknowledge what that implies about who had the knowledge first. Here's what we know for certain. LIDAR revealed hundreds of sites nobody knew existed. Many of those sites show construction techniques predating the Khmer Empire. Erosion analysis suggests some structures are far older than official dates. Chinese records describe Angkor before it officially existed. DNA evidence shows continuous population without migration events. And despite all of this, almost no excavations are permitted that might clarify the timeline. That is not archaeology. That is archaeology prevention. And when governments prevent archaeology, you have to ask what they are afraid of finding. The climate data told us when Angkor fell. The hydraulic evidence showed us the system that sustained it. But the forbidden archaeology reveals something far more significant. Angkor's collapse was not the end of a civilization. It was the end of the most recent phase of something much older. Something that someone, for reasons we can only speculate about, does not want uncovered. Now, we need to talk about the official story of how Angkor died. Because when you actually examine the evidence, the invasion that supposedly destroyed the city starts to look less like a conquest and more like a cover story. Every schoolchild in Thailand learns the story. In 1431, the armies of Ayutthaya marched on Angkor, sacked the greatest city in Southeast Asia, and brought the Khmer Empire to its knees. The Thai king Boramara Chatharat II captured the city after a brutal siege, looted its treasures, and forced the Khmer court to flee south to Phnom Penh. It is a founding myth of Thai national pride. The moment when Siam became the dominant power in the region, there is just one problem. None of the physical evidence supports it. When armies sack cities, they leave signatures that archaeologists can read like text. Buildings burn, and charcoal layers mark the destruction horizon. Walls get torn down, and rubble spreads across floors. Defenders die in large numbers, and their bodies get buried hastily in mass graves. Valuables get looted, but looters leave behind broken pottery, scattered coins, and disturbed storage areas. Sacked cities scream their trauma from the soil. Rome destroyed Carthage so thoroughly in 146 BCE that archaeologists excavating the site 2100 years later still find a destruction layer 6 feet thick. Ash, burned wood, melted metal, collapsed buildings, all compressed into a geological bookmark marking the day Carthage died. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, they killed so many people that the Tigris River reportedly ran red, then black with ink from destroyed libraries. The archaeological evidence matches the historical accounts perfectly. Now look at Angkor. Archaeologists have been excavating the site for over 120 years. They have dug through temple complexes, residential areas, industrial zones, and defensive structures. They have examined every major building, mapped every wall, and cataloged destruction patterns across the entire 3,000 square kilometer urban complex. And they have found essentially nothing that indicates violent conquest. There are no large-scale burn layers from 1431. There are no mass graves, no scattered skeletal remains showing trauma from weapons. The temples stand intact with their treasures still in place. The famous bas-reliefs that cover Angkor Wat's walls, depicting battles and mythology in exquisite detail, show no damage from systematic looting. The gold leaf that once covered many temple surfaces was removed, but the removal patterns suggest careful stripping over time, not frenzied plundering during a sack. The defensive walls surrounding the city remain largely intact. If Ayutthaya forces besieged Angkor, they apparently did so without catapults, without battering rams, and without any of the siege equipment that would leave archaeological traces. The gates show no evidence of forced entry. The moats were not filled in to allow assault. The towers along the walls were not burned or toppled. It looks less like a city that was conquered and more like a city that was abandoned before anyone arrived. David Chandler, one of the foremost historians of Cambodia, addressed this discrepancy in his book, A History of Cambodia. He notes that Thai historical records from the period are suspiciously vague about the details of the 1431 campaign. They record that Ayutthaya forces entered Angkor and that the Khmer king fled, but they provide almost no details about battles, casualties, or resistance. For a conquest of the largest city in the region, the accounts are remarkably sparse. Compare that to how Thai chronicles describe other military campaigns. When Ayutthaya fought the Burmese or battled other Thai kingdoms, the records overflow with specifics: troop numbers, battle formations, duration of sieges, names of commanders, lists of captured loot. But for Angkor, the greatest prize in Southeast Asia, the records are almost dismissive. A few sentences. No glory, no detail, no celebration. Why would Thai chroniclers downplay their greatest military victory, unless it was not a victory? Unless the Thai army marched into an already empty city and claimed credit for a collapse that had already happened. The timeline supports this interpretation. Remember the inscription's silence. The last major Sanskrit inscription at Angkor dates to 1327, 104 years before the supposed invasion. For over a century, a literate civilization that had documented everything suddenly stopped writing. That is not a gradual decline. That is systemic collapse happening long before any Siamese soldiers showed up. Zhou Dagwan's account provides a critical data point. This Chinese diplomat visited Angkor from 1296 to 1297 and wrote detailed observations of daily life. He described a functioning, wealthy city with bustling markets, elaborate religious ceremonies, and a complex social hierarchy. His account is considered one of the most valuable primary sources about Angkor at its height, but Zhou noted something strange. He observed that the city had already been abandoned once before, then reoccupied. He described sections of the urban area that were overgrown and empty, areas that had clearly been inhabited once but were now deserted. In 1297, Angkor was already showing signs of partial abandonment, that is 134 years before the Siamese invasion. So here is the real timeline. 1327, inscriptions stop, 1297. Chinese observer notes partial abandonment already occurring. 1340s to 1370s, mega drought and climate chaos. 1431. Thai forces allegedly conquer the city, but that is not a story of sudden military defeat. That is a story of slow collapse, spanning over a century, with the military conquest tacked on at the end as an explanation. Elite abandonment explains the evidence better than invasion. If you were a member of Angkor's ruling class in the early 1300s, and you saw the hydraulic system failing, the climate destabilizing, and social order beginning to fray, what would you do? Would you stay and face collapse? Or would you quietly relocate while you still had resources and options? Temple inscriptions were carved by and for the elite, kings, priests, and nobility. When the inscriptions stop in 1327, it is not because everyone disappeared. It is because the people who could read and write Sanskrit left first. They saw the trajectory, understood the city was dying, and departed while departures were still possible. The common people likely remained for decades, maintaining what they could until the system degraded to the point where staying was no longer viable. This pattern of elite exodus before final collapse appears in other civilizations. The Western Roman Empire did not fall all at once in 476. For decades before that date, wealthy Romans had been relocating to Constantinople, to North Africa, to anywhere more stable. By the time the last emperor was deposed, Rome was already a shadow of itself, abandoned by anyone who mattered. The formal end was just acknowledgement of a process that had been happening for generations. If Angkor's elite left in the 1320s and 1330s, where did they go? Phnom Penh is the obvious answer, and historical records do show the Khmer capital relocating there in the 15th century. But Phnom Penh in the 1300s was not a city. It was barely a settlement. You cannot move the administrative apparatus of a million-person empire to a riverside village without leaving massive archaeological evidence of sudden urbanization, and that evidence does not exist at Phnom Penh for the relevant period. Some researchers suggest the elite did not relocate to another city. They dispersed, scattered to smaller settlements across the region, blending into local populations, abandoning their administrative roles, and becoming just another lineage among many. If you were a literate priest or a skilled administrator, you could find work anywhere. You did not need to stay in a failing city just because your ancestors had. This dispersal would explain the genetic continuity. The DNA evidence showing no population bottleneck does not mean everyone stayed at Angkor. It means the population spread out across Cambodia without being replaced by outside groups. The civilization did not vanish. It dissolved, which brings us back to 1431. If the city was already mostly empty, already largely abandoned, what exactly did the Thai forces conquer? Probably a remnant population maintaining the temples and living in the shadow of former glory. Maybe a few thousand people, where once hundreds of thousands lived. The Thai forces walked in, claimed victory over an empty shell, and history recorded it as a conquest. Thailand and Cambodia have been arguing over Angkor's legacy for centuries. Both countries claim cultural ownership. Both use Angkorian history to support modern nationalist narratives. And both have incentives to maintain the invasion story, because the invasion story is clean. Thais get to claim they defeated the Khmer Empire. Cambodians get to claim they were conquered by force rather than admitting their civilization collapsed from internal failures. Nobody wants to admit the truth, that Angkor died slowly, from the inside, and the final act was just theater. But the evidence is clear: no mass graves, no destruction layers, no archaeological signature of conquest, just silence, abandonment, and jungle reclamation. The Siamese invasion did not destroy Angkor. It arrived at the funeral and claimed credit for the death. Now we need to examine what was happening inside Angkor before the elite fled. Because when you tear apart the social fabric of a civilization through forced religious transformation, you create the conditions for everything else to fail. Walk through Angkor Wat today, and you will see something odd. Thousands of Hindu statues, carved with breathtaking skill, depicting Vishnu, Shiva, Brahma, and the entire Hindu pantheon. Except many of them are missing their faces. The heads are intact, but the facial features have been systematically chiseled away, not by looters looking for portable treasures, not by time and weathering, by deliberate, targeted vandalism. Someone went through the temples with tools and erased the faces of gods. This was not random destruction. It was iconoclasm, religious purging, and it happened at a very specific moment in Angkor's history that almost nobody talks about. For over 400 years, Angkor was a Hindu civilization. The kings were manifestations of Shiva or Vishnu on earth. The temples were not just religious buildings, they were cosmic diagrams in stone, representations of Mount Meru, the center of the Hindu universe. The entire social order rested on the Devaraja cult, the doctrine that the king was literally divine. When the king performed rituals, he maintained cosmic balance. When he built temples, he strengthened the connection between heaven and earth. The system worked because everyone believed it. Then, in 1181, a man named Jayavarman VII took the throne, and everything changed. Jayavarman VII is celebrated in Cambodian history as Angkor's greatest builder. During his reign, which lasted until around 1218, he constructed more temples than all previous kings combined. The Bayon, Taprom, Prayakan, Bante Kadi, dozens of hospitals, hundreds of rest houses along roads. He transformed Angkor's landscape. But he did something else too. He converted the empire to Buddhism, not gradually, not through gentle persuasion, through state policy enforced from the top down. This was not Mahayana Buddhism integrating peacefully with existing Hindu practices, which had been happening for centuries. This was Theravada Buddhism, presented as a replacement for Hinduism. And Jayavarman did not just build Buddhist temples. He began systematically converting Hindu temples into Buddhist sites. Statues were removed or defaced. Hindu imagery was covered over with Buddhist iconography. Inscriptions praising Shiva were recarved to honor Buddha. Imagine living through this. For your entire life, the cosmic order depended on the king being the earthly incarnation of Vishnu. The temples, the rituals, the entire structure of meaning in your world rested on that foundation. Then suddenly the king declares that actually Hinduism is obsolete, Buddhism is the true path, and the gods your family worshipped for generations need to have their faces removed from the walls. What does that do to social cohesion? The standard academic view is that Jayavarman's conversion was genuine spiritual evolution, that he adopted Buddhism after witnessing suffering during wars with Champa, and that his religious transformation was a compassionate turn toward Buddhist principles. That narrative is politically safe. It portrays the religious shift as enlightened progress. But there is another way to read the evidence, as social engineering, as an attempt by a new dynasty to break the power of the old religious establishment. The Devaraja cult concentrated enormous power in the Brahmin priestly class. These were the people who performed the rituals that legitimized the king. They controlled temple wealth. They administered the education system. They were literate when almost everyone else was not. They interpreted cosmic signs and declared divine will. A smart king looking at that power structure might reasonably ask, how do I rule when the priests can declare me illegitimate? Converting to Buddhism solves that problem. Theravada Buddhism does not require an elaborate priestly class. It emphasizes personal enlightenment over ritual. It is, in many ways, a direct challenge to Brahminical authority. By converting the empire, Jayavarman gutted the power base of the people who could challenge him. He replaced a religion of royal divinity with a religion of personal spiritual practice. That is not spiritual evolution. That is a political purge dressed in religious language. And it worked for Jayavarman's lifetime. But after he died, the backlash began. The inscriptions from the decades after Jayavarman's death show something fascinating. Many of them indicate Hindu revivals, temples being reconverted, Buddhist imagery being removed, a tug of war playing out across the religious landscape as different factions fought for control of the sacred narrative. That is not what peaceful religious coexistence looks like. That is what religious civil war looks like when it stays just below the threshold of open violence. This conflict had economic consequences. Temples were not just religious sites, they were economic engines. They owned land, collected taxes, employed thousands of people, and redistributed wealth through religious festivals and charitable activities. When Jayavarman converted temples from Hindu to Buddhist, he was not just changing which gods got worshipped, he was transferring massive amounts of wealth and economic control from one group to another. The people who lost out did not forget. By the early 1300s, around the time the inscriptions stop, there is evidence of wholesale abandonment of certain temple complexes, not because they fell into disrepair, because people stopped supporting them. When a temple's economic model depends on donations, offerings, and state support, and all of that suddenly stops, the temple dies, the priests disperse, the rituals end, the buildings stand empty. Some researchers believe this is the real reason the inscriptions stopped, not because everyone left Angkor, but because the religious institutions that produced inscriptions collapsed. When the temples failed economically, the literate class that depended on them scattered, and without that class, there was nobody left to carve words into stone. This creates a darker picture of Angkor's final century, not a city slowly dying from drought and climate, but a civilization tearing itself apart from within, religious factions fighting for control, economic institutions collapsing as temple networks failed, a literate elite abandoning a system that no longer sustained them, social trust breaking down as the cosmic order people believed in was systematically dismantled and rebuilt and dismantled again. If you control belief, you control everything. Change belief, and you change the foundation of civilization. Jayavarman VII thought he could engineer a new social order through religious transformation. Maybe he succeeded for his lifetime, but after his death, what he built fell apart faster than the stone temples he left behind. There is a pattern here that repeats across history. Egypt's Akhenaten tried to replace traditional gods with monotheistic sun worship. His religious revolution died with him, and his name was erased from king lists. Rome's conversion to Christianity tore the empire apart, creating divisions that contributed to its collapse. The Maya underwent religious transformations in the 9th century that correlated exactly with their civilization's fragmentation. When you fundamentally alter what people believe about cosmic order, you break social cohesion in ways that cannot be repaired. Angkor's religious transformation was not a footnote to its collapse. It was a primary driver. When the climate stress hit in the 1340s, when the hydraulic system started failing, when difficult decisions needed to be made, there was no unified social structure capable of responding. The religious civil war had already destroyed that. All the drought did was expose how hollow the civilization had become. Before we move toward understanding what finally ended Angkor, there is one more piece of evidence that mainstream archaeology desperately wants to ignore. Chemical analysis of soil around the temples has revealed something that suggests the final years were even stranger and more toxic than anyone wants to admit. In 2019, a team of environmental scientists conducting routine soil contamination surveys around Angkor's temple complexes found something they were not looking for: mercury. Not trace amounts that might occur naturally. Concentrations high enough to classify the soil as hazardous waste by modern standards. The levels were particularly elevated around 3 specific sites: Phnom Bakheng, the Bayon, and a cluster of smaller temples in the royal palace area. The findings appeared briefly in an environmental chemistry journal, raised a few eyebrows, and then vanished from academic discussion. Nobody wanted to talk about what mercury was doing in the dirt of a medieval city. Mercury is not a common environmental contaminant in pre-industrial sites. It does not occur naturally in high concentrations in Cambodian soil. It does not leach from sandstone or laterite. the primary building materials of Angkor. For mercury to be present at the levels detected, it had to be introduced deliberately, in large quantities, over extended periods, which means someone at Angkor was using mercury for something. The question is, what? The official explanation, when pressed, is that mercury was used in gold extraction. The amalgamation process, where mercury binds with gold to separate it from ore, has been known since ancient times. Angkor's wealth included substantial gold reserves. Perhaps metalworkers used mercury in refining processes, and centuries of this activity left chemical residues in the soil. Plausible, boring, and almost certainly incomplete, because the mercury concentrations are not where you would expect them if this was industrial gold processing. They are highest around temples, specifically around temples associated with royal rituals and tantric Buddhist practices. And when you dig into what tantric Buddhism actually involved during this period, mercury appears in a very different context. Tantric traditions across Asia, from Tibet to India to Southeast Asia, incorporated mercury into spiritual practices. Not metaphorically, literally. Mercury was considered a divine substance, the seed of Shiva, capable of conferring immortality when properly prepared. Alchemical texts from this period describe elaborate processes for purifying mercury, combining it with sulfur, heating it, distilling it, and ultimately consuming it as an elixir of life. Yes, consuming it, drinking liquid metal to achieve immortality. We know this sounds insane. Mercury is extremely toxic. Ingesting it causes kidney failure, neurological damage, tremors, cognitive decline, and death. Any civilization advanced enough to build Angkor should have understood this. Except there is substantial evidence that Angkor's elite did not understand it, or understood it and did not care. Or most disturbingly, understood it and believed the spiritual benefits outweighed the physical consequences. Research into Khmer religious practices has uncovered references to rasayana, the Sanskrit term for alchemical elixirs. Inscriptions mention royal rituals involving sacred substances that confer divine properties. Later, Thai chronicles describing captured Khmer nobles note strange behaviors consistent with mercury poisoning, tremors, erratic decision-making, paranoia. Modern scholars dismiss these as exaggerations or insults. But what if they were clinical observations? If Angkor's ruling class was systematically poisoning itself with mercury in pursuit of immortality, it would explain several mysteries. The sudden stop of inscriptions in 1327 could correlate with cognitive decline among the literate elite who were the primary consumers of alchemical preparations. The apparent abandonment by the ruling class decades before the final collapse makes sense if they were dying from toxic metal accumulation. The lack of coherent response to climate crisis fits a leadership suffering from mercury-induced neurological damage. This is not wild speculation. We have historical parallels. Chinese emperors from multiple dynasties died from mercury elixirs prepared by court alchemists. The Qin Emperor Qin Shi Huang, obsessed with immortality, consumed mercury compounds and died at 49, possibly from poisoning. His tomb, when eventually excavated, showed mercury levels in the soil so high that archaeologists initially thought their equipment was malfunctioning. If Chinese emperors were killing themselves this way, why not Khmer god kings pursuing the same immortality? But mercury is not the only metallurgical mystery at Angkor. Analysis of metal artifacts recovered from sealed contexts has revealed something equally strange. Iron tools with carbon content and tempering quality that should not exist in 13th century Southeast Asia. The metallurgy is too advanced. The techniques required to produce steel of this quality would not be developed in the region for another 300 years. Yet here they are, buried in dated archaeological layers that predate European contact. Where did this knowledge come from? The standard answer is trade. That Angkor imported superior metal goods from China or India and local smiths never developed equivalent skills, but the tools show signs of local manufacture. The metal composition includes trace elements from Cambodian ore sources. These were not imports. They were made at Angkor using techniques nobody can explain. Some researchers point to this as evidence of the older civilization theory, that the advanced hydraulic engineering, the astronomical knowledge, and the metallurgical skill were all inherited from an earlier, more sophisticated culture that Angkor built upon. That the Khmer Empire was not inventing these technologies, but preserving and applying knowledge from a lost predecessor. That theory makes mainstream archaeologists extremely uncomfortable because it implies cultural continuity, stretching back millennia, which contradicts the neat timeline of Angkor rising in 802. But it would explain the metallurgical anomalies. It would explain the pre-existing hydraulic infrastructure. It would explain the astronomical precision that requires centuries of observation. Then there are the magnetic anomalies. Geophysical surveys of Phnom Bakheng, the temple mountain at Angkor's center, have detected localized magnetic field disturbances that do not match the surrounding geology. Magnetometers show readings suggesting the presence of either buried ferromagnetic materials in quantities that make no architectural sense or geological formations that should not exist in this location. Several papers have been published describing these anomalies. None offer satisfactory explanations. Requests for excavation permits to investigate have been denied. What is buried under Phnom Bakheng that creates magnetic disturbances? Iron deposits do not explain the pattern. Natural magnetite formations do not match the geometry. Some researchers have suggested the anomalies indicate buried metalworking facilities, perhaps furnaces or forges operating at temperatures high enough to magnetize surrounding soils. But medieval metallurgy did not produce the kind of sustained, high-temperature processes that would create these signatures. There is a research paper from 2013 that appeared briefly on an academic preprint server before being withdrawn. The author, a geophysicist whose name has been scrubbed from the archived version, suggested the magnetic anomalies were consistent with high-energy electromagnetic events, not natural geological processes, not metallurgical activities, something else. The paper was removed within 72 hours. No explanation was given. The researcher has not published on Angkor since. So we are left with mercury in the soil at toxic levels, concentrated around ritual sites, metallurgical artifacts that should not exist, magnetic anomalies nobody will investigate, and a pattern of evidence suppression that suggests someone does not want these questions answered. Maybe the mercury was just gold processing. Maybe the advanced metallurgy was imported. Maybe the magnetic readings are instrument errors. Or maybe Angkor's final decades involved practices and technologies that do not fit any comfortable narrative about medieval civilization. Maybe the ruling class really was poisoning itself chasing immortality while the world fell apart around them. Maybe there were secrets in those temples that died with the people who understood them. What we know for certain is this: the soil is contaminated, the metal is anomalous, and nobody is allowed to dig deeper. Draw your own conclusions. But when you step back and look at everything together, a picture emerges. And it is not the picture they teach in textbooks. The year 1347. In a port city on the Black Sea, merchant ships unload cargo from the east. Within weeks, Kaffa's population begins dying. Buboes appear on necks and groins. Fever spreads faster than fire. By 1348, the plague has reached Constantinople, then Italy, then France. Within 5 years, somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people are dead. Nearly half of Europe's population gone. The Black Death had arrived, and the world would never be the same. That same year, 1347, tree rings in Cambodia show the second year of the mega-drought. Angkor's reservoirs are running dangerously low. The canals are silting up faster than crews can dredge them. Inscriptions stopped 20 years earlier. The elite have already left, and halfway around the world, in a Crimean port city, rats are boarding ships that will carry death across 3 continents. Coincidence? Or were these connected? The 1400s were a catastrophe for human civilization globally, not just in one region, everywhere. At the same time, the Black Death killed more people than any event in human history except perhaps the Toba supervolcano 70,000 years ago. But the plague was just one symptom of a planetary system in crisis. The Little Ice Age was beginning. Glaciers in the Alps advanced, swallowing villages that had stood for centuries. Growing seasons shortened across Europe and Asia. The Thames River in London froze solid for the first time in recorded history. In China, the Yellow River froze, disrupting agriculture and trade. Monsoon patterns shifted across Asia. bringing drought to some regions and catastrophic flooding to others. The climate stability that had supported civilizations for the previous 1,000 years simply stopped, and civilizations collapsed. Not just Angkor. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, fragmented between 1330 and 1370. Officially, historians blame succession disputes and administrative overreach, but the timing matches exactly with climate deterioration and plague outbreaks across the Silk Road. The empire that had connected East and West, facilitating trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale, shattered into competing khanates that spent the next century fighting each other. In Europe, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions before the plague ever arrived. Crops failed across the continent for 3 consecutive years. People resorted to eating bark, grass, and in documented cases, each other. This was not a regional crop failure. This was synchronized agricultural collapse across different climate zones simultaneously. The Maya cities in Central America, already in decline, received their final blow during this same period. Prolonged droughts in the 1300s, documented in the same sediment cores and tree ring data that recorded Angkor's climate crisis, devastated what remained of classic Maya civilization. By 1400, most of the great cities were abandoned. The survivors scattered into smaller settlements, their monumental architecture swallowed by jungle just like Angkor. The ancestral Puebloans in what is now the American Southwest abandoned their cliff dwellings during the late 1300s. Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, entire regional networks of settlements emptied out. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, shows the same pattern. Multi-decade drought starting in the 1340s, followed by population dispersal. The pattern repeats across the globe. Different civilizations, different continents, no contact with each other. All collapsing during the same narrow window of time. All responding to the same climate forcing. All experiencing synchronized catastrophe. This is where conventional history becomes uncomfortable, because if you acknowledge that civilizations across the planet collapsed simultaneously from shared environmental pressures, you have to confront a disturbing possibility. That civilization itself is fragile. That the stability we take for granted is an anomaly. That collapse is not the exception. It is the default state, and we are all living on borrowed time. But there is another layer to this. The 1400 reset was not the first time this happened. Go back exactly 12,000 years to around 10,800 BCE, the Younger Dryas period. Global temperatures plummeted, megafauna went extinct, and there is growing evidence, still controversial but accumulating, that advanced civilizations existing before this period were wiped out. Göbekli Tepe, in Turkey, built around 9,500 BCE, shows construction techniques that should not exist for hunter-gatherers emerging from an ice age. Unless they were not emerging, unless they were rebuilding, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a comet or asteroid airburst triggered the climate catastrophe. Platinum anomalies in sediment layers, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, all the signatures of extraterrestrial impact appear in the geological record at exactly the right time. Mainstream science is still debating this, but the evidence keeps mounting. And if it is true, it means civilization has been reset before, completely, globally. So, here is the pattern. 12,000 years ago, catastrophic climate shift, possible impact event, civilizations erased. 3,600 years ago, Bronze Age collapse, multiple civilizations falling simultaneously around 1200 BCE. Then the 1400 reset. Angkor, the Mongols, the Maya, the Puebloans, all going down together. Are these random? Or is there a cycle? Some researchers point to solar cycles, to magnetic pole excursions, to orbital mechanics that create periodic climate instability. Others suggest cosmic events, impacts, or near misses that disrupt Earth systems on regular intervals. The most disturbing possibility is that these collapses are built into the system. That civilization grows during stable climate periods, becomes dependent on that stability, and then gets destroyed when the inevitable shift comes. If that is true, then Angkor is not ancient history. It is a preview. Because we are living in another period of unprecedented climate instability. We are experiencing synchronized environmental stress across ecosystems globally. We have built a civilization utterly dependent on stable weather, predictable rainfall, and moderate temperatures, and all of those things are changing. The people of Angkor thought their hydraulic system made them immune to drought. They were wrong. The Romans thought their empire was eternal. They were wrong. Every civilization that collapsed believed they were different, that their technology or their gods or their organizational genius made them special. None of them survived. What makes us think we will? Angkor is not just the story of one city falling apart. It is the story of what happens when systems become too complex to maintain, when environmental stress exceeds adaptation capacity, when social cohesion breaks down and nobody knows how to stop the spiral. 750,000 people did not vanish into thin air. They dispersed, they scattered, they forgot who they were. Within a few generations, the descendants of people who built the largest city on Earth could not read their own ancestors' inscriptions. That is how fast civilization can be forgotten. Right now, as you are watching this, what time is it where you are? Morning? Evening? Middle of the night? Wherever you are, whatever time it is, understand this. The past is not as distant as you think. The patterns that destroyed Angkor are the same patterns appearing in our climate data today. The social fractures that tore apart Khmer society are visible in our institutions right now. The elite exodus, the institutional failure, the religious conflicts, the environmental collapse, all of it is happening again, just in slow motion, just slow enough that we can pretend it is not. Angkor fell without a trace because nobody wrote down the end. The people who could write had already left. The people who remained did not know how. So the story was lost, replaced by myths and legends and convenient lies about invasions that never happened. What will they say about us? Will they wonder where we went? Will they find our cities overgrown and try to reconstruct what happened from soil samples and ruined buildings? Or will we be smarter than Angkor? Will we recognize the patterns and break the cycle? If you made it this far, if you watched this entire documentary questioning everything you thought you knew about history, then you are the kind of person who might actually help change the ending. Subscribe to Tales Before Tesla, because we are going to keep digging into the stories they do not want you to hear, the patterns they do not want you to recognize, the evidence they keep buried. Angkor collapsed without a trace. But you are still here. You can still see the pattern. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? The past is not over. It is waiting. And the clock is counting down whether we acknowledge it or not. Comment below what time it is where you are watching, because time matters, and we are running out of it faster than anyone wants to admit.